Imagine being sealed inside a steel coffin moving through history, where the first echo comes from World War II smoke-filled battlefields, and the last scream belongs to a modern battlefield ruled by physics not courage, when a single armor-piercing strike turns a tank into a killing chamber in less time than the brain can understand. Metal becomes shrapnel, air becomes fire, sound becomes pressure, and men become casualties before fear even forms. This is not about strategy, medals, or heroism. This is about what really happens inside a tank when armor fails, bodies rupture, lungs burn, memory fractures, and survival depends on where you are standing. In a space smaller than a bedroom, this story strips away cinematic lies and recruiting posters and forces you to face the same truth tank crews have known for a century, that when the box is opened, there is no control, only milliseconds of violence that decide who vanishes instantly and who lives long enough to remember everything. The story begins not with speed or precision, but with fear-cramped metal and blind faith during the Second World War, when tanks were still experimental monsters and crews climbed inside without truly knowing what awaited them once steel met steel. Early anti-tank weapons did not rely on refined physics, but brute force and proximity rifles, cannons, and shaped charges fired at distances so close crews could hear the enemy shouting outside. When armor failed, the violence was slow enough to be understood, yet fast enough to overwhelm the senses. Steel plates bent inward like tearing paper, interior surfaces shattered into jagged shards that ricocheted through the crew space. Men were not pierced cleanly, they were shredded, faces, hands, and torsos cut apart by fragments that moments earlier had been part of their own vehicle. Fire followed smoke, followed then panic, not cinematic panic, but animal confusion where training dissolved and survival meant instinct. Drivers sometimes felt the hit before they heard it, a violent punch through the hull, followed by pressure that crushed the chest and burst eardrums. Gunners were often the first to die, their position closest to the armor and the gun made them targets for spall. Storms that struck with the density of a shotgun blast at point-blank range. Loaders surrounded by ammunition faced a different fate. Even a small penetration could ignite propellant charges, turning the fighting compartment into an oven. Crews described flames rolling across the ceiling, blue and orange, feeding on cordite grease and fire escape hatches. Jammed radios died visibility. Vanished men burned alive, inches from freedom. Those who survived seconds remembered them forever. Battlefield medics found bodies with dozens of wounds from a single hit, unable to explain how one projectile had caused such chaos. Because the violence happened inside, unseen, the tank became a sealed execution chamber. During late war battles, as armor improved, so did the weapons. German and Allied forces learned that killing a tank meant killing its crew, and penetration was only the beginning. What followed was fragmentation, fire, and pressure that left little intact. Survivors of knocked out Shermans spoke of 30 seconds as the difference between life and death, not because the tank exploded instantly, but because fire spread fast and fear slowed movement. Hands slipped, legs tangled, voices screamed commands that no one could follow. By the time the war ended, armies understood something grim. Tanks were not just machines of offense, they were mobile coffins whose protection failed catastrophically, and when the Cold War arrived, engineers chased a new solution: velocity, density, and pure physics, setting the stage for a far more violent future where impacts would no longer feel slow or survivable, but instantaneous, absolute, and unforgiving. By the time the Cold War hardened into doctrine, tanks were no longer blunt instruments, but mathematical problems solved with velocity, mass, and certainty. And the moment a kinetic penetrator entered the battlefield, the nature of death inside armor changed forever. No longer gradual, no longer chaotic, but brutally precise. When a tungsten or depleted uranium dart struck armor at speeds exceeding human comprehension, the impact did not feel like an explosion. It felt like reality tearing itself apart. Armor plates did not crack, they liquefied, behaving like fluid under impossible pressure, and from the inside, the crew experienced a flash of white light, followed by a storm of fragments. Moving faster than thought, spalling became the invisible executioner. Shards of superheated metal peeled from the interior armor surface, erupting outward in a widening cone, cutting through flesh, uniforms, equipment, radios, limbs. All at once, men were not struck one after another, they were struck simultaneously. Dozens of impacts in a single instant. Medics later struggled to understand how one hit could leave bodies resembling victims of sustained machine gun fire, yet no bullets had entered the tank, because the tank itself had become the weapon. If it remained intact, continued its path through the crew compartment, a dense spear of metal traveling through confined air, compressing turning it into a pressure wave that ruptured organs without touching them. Lungs collapsed, eyes burst, eardrums failed, and some crew members who showed no visible wounds died seconds later from internal hemorrhage alone. Soviet training manuals quietly acknowledged this, listing overpressure casualties as unsurvivable even without direct contact. And then came the heat-depleted uranium burned as it passed through the tank, igniting fragments and vaporized metal flash, heating the air until breathing became lethal. Crew members near the penetration path inhaled superheated gases that scorched their respiratory systems from the inside, a death delayed just long enough for awareness. Some survived the initial hit, only to collapse moments later, drowning in their own destroyed lungs. While alarms screamed uselessly, secondary impacts multiplied the horror. Hydraulic lines severed, sprayed flammable fluid under immense pressure, coating men in liquid. Fire batteries ruptured, fuel vaporized, and if the penetrator touched ammunition, the event ended instantly. Turrets launched skyward, holes split open, and nothing recognizable remained. In conflicts from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, recovery teams learned to identify kills by silhouette alone because there was nothing left to recover. Inside tanks with carousel autoloaders became infamous for this, their ammunition stored beneath the crew, ensuring that penetration equaled erasure. Western designs improved survival odds but not outcomes. Spall liners reduced fragment spray, blowout panels redirected explosions, but the initial millisecond still decided everything. Some crew lived because physics spared them by inches, others died because chance placed them directly in the invisible cone of destruction. Survivors described a strange silence after impact, not peace, but disconnection. As if time skipped forward, they remembered light pressure, then being outside the tank with no memory of escape. Their minds protected them by deleting what their eyes had seen, and weeks later, fragments of memory returned in nightmares, screaming, metal heat, and faces frozen mid-moment. This was armored warfare stripped of myth. No duels, no tactics, just equations resolving inside steel boxes, where survival depended not on bravery but on geometry, timing, and where you were standing when the universe collapsed inward. As warfare entered the late 20th and early 21st century, the tank did not become obsolete. It became hunted, and the weapons designed to kill it evolved to exploit every remaining weakness, not through brute force, but intelligent angles, guidance systems, and delayed violence. Modern anti-tank missiles no longer rushed toward the thickest armor. Instead, they climbed, curved, and descended, striking from above, where protection was thinnest and survival margins vanished. Top attack weapons transformed the interior experience of penetration into something even more disorienting, because the crew often never heard the launch, only the impact. A sudden vertical intrusion tearing through roof armor, sending spall downward like metallic rain, striking shoulders, heads, and instruments in a space never designed to absorb violence from above. Those not killed instantly were thrown against hard steel surfaces by the concussive force, disoriented, blind ears ringing, unable to understand what had happened. Fire suppression systems activated in seconds, filling the compartment with chemical fog, reducing visibility to nothing, while wounded men tried to locate hatches. Through muscle memory alone, heat still followed, not always explosive, but intense localized flashes that ignited wiring, insulation, and hydraulic mist, creating rolling fires that chased oxygen from the air. Breathing became shallow, panicked, desperate. Some crews escaped, not because their tank saved them, but because modern designs delayed death just long enough for evacuation. Blowout panels functioned, ammunition did not detonate, and the vehicle remained structurally intact, but escape itself became a test of cognition under trauma. Fingers numb, vision tunneled. Time stretched. Survivors later recalled watching flames move in slow motion, while knowing intellectually they had only seconds to act. Others froze, unable to process commands, their brains overwhelmed by stimulus saturation. Psychologists studying armored warfare casualties noted that modern survivability features reduced fatalities but increased long-term trauma, because more crew lived long enough to witness the destruction around them. Burned, wounded comrades, trapped, screaming, and the impossible decision of whether to help or flee. Modern tanks became paradoxes, safer machines that exposed their operators to more memory, more guilt, more aftermath. Even when penetrations did not kill outright, they maimed limbs crushed by collapsing structures, burns that fused skin to metal, and inhalation injuries that destroyed lungs without visible scars. Medical evacuation reports from recent conflicts describe tank crew survivors arriving conscious, coherent, and seemingly stable, only to deteriorate rapidly as internal damage manifested hours later. Lungs flooded, organs flailed, and shocks set in despite advanced medicine. Physics had already decided the outcome. The missile had done its work in silence milliseconds before the human response could begin, and for those who survived physically, the mental damage followed delayed. Real. When all the physics are explained and all the diagrams fade, what remains is not steel or velocity, but people, and this is where armored warfare becomes hardest to justify and impossible to romanticize. Recruiting videos show power, precision control, but never the aftermath, never the silence inside a disabled tank, where alarms scream to no one, and bodies lie where they fell, never the smell that clings to survivors long after the smoke clears, a mix of burned insulation, fuel, and something unmistakably human. Modern militaries speak carefully using terms like crew neutralized or vehicle destroyed, but those words collapse under the weight of reality, because behind each phrase are individuals whose last moments were spent inside a confined metal space experiencing fear, confusion, and sensory overload beyond description. Families are told their loved ones died instantly because anything else would be unbearable to explain, and sometimes that is true, but often it is not. Often there were seconds, sometimes longer, where awareness remained, where voices were heard, hands were reached for, and decisions were made that would echo for decades in the minds of those who survived. Armored warfare creates a unique form of trauma, because it compresses violence into such an intense short span that the brain fractures, trying to process its. Survivors describe their memories not as scenes, but as flashes. Pressure, light, heat, sound, cut into fragments that resurface without warning years later. Modern tank design has undeniably saved lives, but it has also created a new reality where more crew live through the initial impact, only to carry invisible wounds that medicine struggles to treat. Guilt over escaping when others did not, anger at machines that failed, and a deep mistrust of the myths they were taught before climbing inside the box. Historians often debate whether tanks dominate battlefields or whether missiles have ended their relevance, but those debates miss the point, because as long as tanks exist, people will sit inside them, and as long as people sit inside them, someone will design weapons to open them, and when that happens, the outcome will always be brutal regardless of era or technology. Understanding this does not mean rejecting those who serve it, means respecting them enough to tell the truth. The tank is not a symbol of invincibility. It is a compromise between protection and exposure, and when it fails absolutely. If this story unsettled you, that is the point, because warfare should never feel comfortable or cinematic. And if you want more content that cuts through propaganda myths and polished narratives to expose the human cost hidden inside machines history prefers to glorify, then subscribe to this channel. We do not chase spectacle, we uncover reality and the stories that textbooks and trailers leave behind.